At Christmas dinner, my family decided to break me. Around that dinner table, my father raised his glass and mocked that I lived like a beggar. My mother smiled as if cruelty was tradition, and my sister laughed that no man would ever want me while showing off her diamond ring. I sat there with my cheeks burning, every eye on me, waiting for me to shrink into silence the way I always had. But inside I was steady, because I had brought something with me, something they never expected. I reached into my purse, slid an envelope across the table, and watched the room freeze. Their voices died, their faces drained of color, and for the first time in my life I held the power. That envelope looked ordinary, but what was inside would tear down their pride and expose a truth they had mocked me for never having. And that night, everything began to change. The snow was already falling in thick white sheets when I pulled my car up to the front gate of my parents' house in the suburbs outside Chicago. The lights strung along the roofline blinked red and green, a perfect display of holiday cheer, and the front yard had one of those inflatable Santas swaying in the wind. I sat there with the engine running, staring at the familiar brick house and feeling that old tightness in my chest. Christmas Eve had always been complicated in this family, but this year I felt it more than ever. I took a deep breath, shut off the ignition, and grabbed the small gift bag I had brought. Inside the house, I could already hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the sound of my sister Jessica's voice rising above everyone else's. She was always the star of the evening, the daughter who could do no wrong, and I knew tonight would be no different. I pushed open the door, stamped the snow off my boots, and stepped into the warmth. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles hit me all at once. My mother Margaret came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a holiday apron with embroidered snowflakes. Her smile froze when she saw me. It was the same strained expression she had given me since I was a teenager, polite on the surface, but with an edge of disappointment she could never hide. "Emily, you're finally here," she said flatly. "Hang your coat there." I forced a smile, kissed her cheek quickly, and walked into the living room. My father, Robert, was already seated in his favorite leather chair, glass of bourbon in hand, his face flushed from drinking and the heat of the fire. He gave me a curt nod, and then turned back toward Daniel, my brother-in-law, who was telling some story about a property deal. Jessica was curled up on the couch in a red velvet dress, her hair in perfect curls, a diamond necklace catching the glow from the Christmas tree. She looked at me with a smirk that was half greeting, half mockery. Her husband, Daniel, gave me one of those condescending smiles that said he tolerated my presence, but barely. I set the gift bag under the tree with the others and sank into the corner of the sofa. My hands were cold despite the heat of the room, and I rubbed them together, listening as Jessica launched into another story about how Daniel's company was expanding, how they were talking to city officials, and how things were about to take off. My parents leaned forward with glowing faces, proud as if the success was theirs too. Then, as if remembering I was there, my father looked at me. His voice cut through the chatter. "Do you know what's funny, Emily? We spent all that money raising you, sending you to school, giving you every chance. And what do you have to show for it? You live like a beggar depending on welfare checks, living off the taxes of people who actually work." The room went still for a second. Jessica's lips curled into a laugh, sharp and gleeful. "Keep living like that," she said, leaning back against Daniel's arm. "You'll never marry a man like mine." My mother gave a tight smile, but did nothing to stop it. Daniel chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. The sting of humiliation burned my face, but I kept my composure. I pressed my fingers against my knees, nails biting into the fabric of my dress, and I said nothing. The silence that followed was heavy. Even the fire seemed to crackle more loudly. My father took another drink and shook his head as if I had proven his point, simply by sitting there. Jessica looked triumphant. Inside, though, I felt something else rising. Not anger, not sadness, but a cold kind of patience. I had been through this routine every holiday, every family gathering, and I knew my silence infuriated them more than any words I could speak. Daniel cleared his throat, eager to keep the spotlight. He began talking about a development deal on the west side of the city, how his company was on the verge of securing a major contract that would bring in millions. My parents listened with rapt attention, nodding, smiling, clapping their hands together. Jessica reached over and squeezed his arm, glowing with pride. I sat back and let their voices wash over me. The ornaments on the Christmas tree sparkled, reflecting little shards of light into my eyes. The smell of pine mixed with the buttery scent of mashed potatoes drifting from the kitchen. For a moment I closed my eyes and let myself drift, not into the present humiliation, but back into the memories that always surfaced on nights like this. I saw myself at 15, standing outside in the snow with my backpack, while my father shouted at me through the doorway that I would never amount to anything. I remembered my mother telling me that no man would ever want someone who worked with the poor, that I was wasting my life. I remembered Jessica's laughter when she got her first designer handbag while I was wearing thrift store jeans. The ache of those years never fully left me, and tonight it returned in full force. When I opened my eyes again, Jessica was watching me, her lips twitching like she could guess exactly what I was thinking. She leaned closer and whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Do you even have a date tonight, Emily? Or are you just going to spend the holidays alone again?" Daniel snorted with laughter. My parents smiled awkwardly, and the humiliation pressed heavier on my chest. I forced myself to breathe slowly to keep my expression neutral. I knew they expected me to break, to argue, to lash out so they could point and say I was the problem. Instead, I simply said, "Merry Christmas, Jessica." Her smile faltered for a second, confused by my calmness, before she turned back to her husband. The rest of the evening unfolded with the same pattern. Jessica and Daniel boasting, my parents glowing, me sitting quietly at the edge of the room. The only sound I contributed was the clink of my glass when I took a sip of wine. The only movement was the steady tapping of my heel against the floor to keep myself from shaking. At one point, my mother brought out the turkey, golden brown and steaming, and the table was set with all the trimmings. We gathered around, hands folded, while my father gave a blessing that somehow managed to include praise for Jessica and Daniel's future. When the plates were passed and conversation resumed, the jokes returned as well. Robert said, "You know, maybe Emily can find some man to take pity on her. There must be someone out there who needs a tax write-off." Margaret laughed lightly, covering her mouth with her hand as if to soften the cruelty. Jessica tilted her head, pretending sympathy, but her eyes were sharp. I focused on cutting my turkey, each slice clean and deliberate, as if the rhythm could block out their voices. But every word lodged in me like a thorn. I excused myself after dessert, carrying my plate to the kitchen. Standing alone for a moment, I leaned against the counter and stared at the dark window above the sink. My reflection looked back at me, pale under the soft light, eyes shadowed with fatigue. I whispered to myself, "Hold on, just a little longer." When I returned to the living room, the family was deep in another conversation about Daniel's company. He was explaining how the mayor's office was reviewing his proposal. My parents looked thrilled. Jessica was glowing. That was when I felt the envelope in my purse, the paper edge pressing against my fingers as if reminding me it was there. My pulse quickened. The timing wasn't right yet, but soon, very soon. I sat down again, folded my hands in my lap, and let the chatter wash over me. The fire popped sparks rising up the chimney. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the street in silence. Inside the house, though, the noise of my family's pride and mockery filled every corner. I sipped my wine slowly, savoring the taste, and let the cold patience settle back over me. Tonight had only just begun, and already the stage was set. I was only half listening to the chatter around the dinner table when the sound of my father's laugh carried me back years in an instant. The way his voice rumbled with self-satisfaction, the tone that always seemed to dismiss me before I even opened my mouth. It triggered a memory that rose so vivid I almost forgot where I was. The warmth of the dining room, the glow of the Christmas tree, it all blurred until I was standing once more in the old house I grew up in. 15 years old and desperate for some kind of approval. I remembered the smell of sawdust clinging to my father's clothes when he came home from the construction supply company he owned. He always had a way of entering a room that made everyone nervous. My sister Jessica would rush to show him her perfect report card or the new dress our mother bought her, while I hung back hoping he would notice me without me begging for it. But it rarely worked that way. One winter evening, I had stayed late at the library finishing a paper for school. I came home with a sense of pride because I had earned an A on the assignment. I walked into the kitchen with the paper still folded in my backpack, ready to show him. He was sitting at this table with a glass of whiskey in front of him. Jessica was there too, twirling her hair, already going on about some award she got in choir. I tried to speak up. "Dad, I wanted to show you something." He looked at me, waited a moment, and then waved his hand. "Later. We are talking about your sister right now." That moment stayed with me for years. The A did not matter. My efforts never mattered. Jessica's smallest accomplishment would be treated like gold, while mine were brushed aside like dust on the counter. Even back then, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I told myself if I worked harder, if I achieved more, maybe then he would see me. I carried that hope all through high school. There was the time I made the honor roll for the entire year. I was so proud I brought the certificate home, taped it to the refrigerator before anyone else could cover it with Jessica's pictures. My mother walked in, took one glance, and peeled it off. "This refrigerator is for important things," she said, and she replaced it with a flyer about Jessica's cheerleading competition. I stood there with the paper in my hand, cheeks burning, and knew better than to protest. The years rolled on with the same rhythm. Jessica was praised for every small victory, while I learned to swallow disappointment until it burned like acid inside me. My mother bought her designer clothes and jewelry even when money was tight, while I wore whatever I could find at thrift stores. When I asked about it, my mother said Jessica needed to look presentable for her future, and implied I would never have one worth dressing for. Those slights might have seemed small from the outside, but they added up. Each comment, each dismissal, each laugh at my expense carved away at something inside me. I learned early on that if I wanted to survive, I had to create my own sense of worth. I got my first job at 16, working part-time at a diner not far from our house. The smell of fried food stuck to my clothes. The tips were meager, but for the first time I had my own money. I still remember the look on my father's face when he came in one afternoon and saw me wiping down tables. He did not smile, he did not say he was proud. He said, "Is this what you want to do with your life? Serve other people's leftovers?" I clenched the rag in my hands and told him it was just a job to save for college. He laughed and said, "College will be a waste for you, Emily. Some people just are not made for bigger things. Jessica maybe, but not you." That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, fighting back tears. I wanted to scream at him to prove him wrong, but I also knew arguing would only give him more power. So I swore silently to myself that I would find another way. During those years, I found small pockets of relief at school. Teachers who noticed my work, a few friends who respected me, the quiet of the library where no one judged me. Still, every time I went home, the weight of my family's scorn pressed down again. One memory in particular haunted me. It was the winter of 2010. The snow was heavy, the roads icy. I had taken the train back from the city after a late tutoring session. I slipped on the sidewalk and tore my jeans open, blood seeping down my knee. When I came in through the door, limping, my mother looked at me with annoyance instead of concern. "What were you doing out so late? You always cause trouble." She handed me a rag instead of a bandage. Jessica peeked around the corner, smirked, and whispered that I looked pathetic. I still remember the sting of that word. Despite it all, I pushed forward. I applied to college, got accepted, and began taking classes in social work. My parents barely acknowledged it. They bragged to the neighbors about Jessica's internship at a marketing firm, but when someone asked about me, they would shrug. "Oh, Emily is just taking some classes. Nothing serious." But it was serious. It was my lifeline. In those classrooms, I found purpose. I discovered a fire inside me to fight for people who were overlooked, dismissed, cast aside, people like me. Still, the family dynamic never changed. Holidays were always the same. Jessica showing off gifts, my parents clapping, and me sitting quietly in the corner. Even when I graduated college in 2015, there was no celebration. They did not attend the ceremony. I walked across the stage in my cap and gown, clutching my diploma, scanning the crowd in vain for a familiar face. All I saw were strangers. Later that night, Jessica posted pictures of her own graduation party from a community college program. Balloons, champagne, a cake with her name in frosting. My parents beaming beside her. I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at the screen, the loneliness gnawing at me. Those were the years that hardened me. I realized I could not wait for their approval. I had to build my own life brick by brick. I took job after job, worked late nights, ate ramen noodles to pay rent. I told myself I was going to make something of myself no matter what they thought. And slowly I did. Looking back, those memories still sting, but they also remind me of how far I have come. My family thought they were breaking me with every cruel word, but in truth they were shaping a resolve stronger than steel. Each slight was a nail, and together they built the foundation of the woman I became. As I sat at the Christmas table in 2023, watching Jessica gloat and my parents beam, I felt all those memories rushing back. It was like a film reel playing behind my eyes, a montage of slights and humiliations. But beneath it all was that steady flame of determination. I had survived their scorn before, and now I carried something they could not imagine. They thought I was still that timid girl waiting for scraps of attention. They had no idea I had built an empire of compassion, a company that touched lives every day. They had no idea the envelope in my purse carried not just news of a wedding, but proof that I had become everything they swore I never could. The weight of those years pressed down on me, but instead of crushing me, it held me upright. My past had become my armor. I remember the first time I turned the key in the office door of the building. That would become Chicago Social Impact Services. The space was nothing more than an abandoned storefront on the south side, dusty blinds hanging halfway down, the floor covered in stains from years of neglect. The landlord seemed almost surprised that I wanted to rent it. He asked if I was sure I wanted a place in that neighborhood. I said yes. Something about the cracked walls and the smell of old wood made me feel at home. It was a beginning, even if no one else could see it. I signed the lease in the spring of 2017 with money I had, scraped together from years of saving. Every late night shift, every second job, every meal I skipped to put away another $20 had led me there. I remember carrying in the first folding chairs by myself, their metal legs clanging against the doorframe, the sound echoing in the empty room. My hands were raw from scrubbing the floor. My back ached from hauling furniture, but my heart pounded with hope. No one in my family knew. If they had, they would have laughed, said I was wasting my time. They would have called it a charity hobby, another excuse for me not to get a real career, so I kept it a secret. I learned early on that silence protected my dreams better than sharing them with people who only wanted to crush them. In those early months, it was just me and a small group of volunteers. I reached out to shelters, community colleges, and churches. We collected donated coats and food, helped single mothers fill out paperwork for housing, and gave teenagers a safe place to do homework. The work was exhausting but pure. Every smile, every thank you, every small victory fueled me. I can still see the face of the first young woman who came through our door. She had a baby on her hip and tears streaking her cheeks. She had been kicked out by her boyfriend and had nowhere to go. I sat her down, gave her a sandwich, and held the baby so she could eat in peace. In that moment, I felt a certainty deeper than anything I had ever known. This was what I was meant to do. By the end of that first year, we had a team of 10. I hired Linda Perez Sharp and organized with a heart as big as mine. She became my partner in every sense except blood. Where I was driven by passion, she brought structure. She kept the books managed, the schedules, and made sure we did not drown in chaos. Together, we transformed that storefront into a lifeline for hundreds of families. Of course, the road was not smooth. There were nights when the heat broke down and we worked in coats, times when the bank account was nearly empty, and I wondered if I had been foolish to try. But every time doubt crept in, something happened to remind me why I kept going. A child laughing as he put on his first winter coat. An elderly woman whispered thank you when we delivered groceries. Those moments were priceless. The city began to take notice. Reporters wrote small stories, donors started calling. By 2019, we moved into a larger building with 3 floors. We had classrooms, a pantry, counseling rooms. Chicago Social Impact Services was no longer a dream scribbled in my notebook. It was real, tangible, thriving. I never told my parents. I visited them occasionally, sitting at their polished dining table, listening to them gush about Jessica's new job title or Daniel's business. They asked me vaguely how I was doing. I would say fine and change the subject. If they pressed, I mentioned I was working at a nonprofit. That word always made my father's lip curl. He would say things like, people who work at nonprofits are just people who cannot make it anywhere else. I nodded and let him believe it. What they never saw was the paycheck that came with being CEO of an organization that had grown to employ over 120 staff by 2023. What they never imagined was that grants and partnerships had given me financial stability far beyond what they assumed. They still pictured me living paycheck to paycheck, clipping coupons, begging for government assistance. They could not have been more wrong. Linda often teased me about it. One night after a long board meeting, she said, "Emily, one day you are going to have to tell them who you really are." I laughed and shook my head. They will never believe it anyway. She frowned and told me keeping it hidden gave them power. I said no, keeping it hidden gave me control. She was not entirely wrong. There were nights I lay awake wondering what it would feel like to stand in front of my parents and tell them everything. To show them the office tower with our name on the lobby wall, to introduce them to the people whose lives we had changed. But deep down I knew it would not matter. They would still find a way to diminish it. So I chose patience. Michael knew the truth, of course. When we first met at a fundraiser, he shook my hand with a firm grip and said he had heard about my work. He looked me in the eye with respect, something I was not used to from men of his stature. Over time, he became not just a supporter but a confidant. He told me that my strength came not from proving myself to those who doubted me, but from serving those who believed in me. His words stayed with me. On the night of the Christmas dinner, as I sat there listening to Jessica and Daniel boast, I thought of Linda's words. I thought of Michael's encouragement. My family's laughter no longer cut as deep because I knew a truth they could not imagine. My silence was not a weakness. It was preparation. The envelope in my purse felt heavier each time I touched it. Inside was not just a wedding invitation. It was a revelation, a declaration that I had built a life on my own terms. My family's opinion no longer defined me. Still sitting at that table, I felt the old ache. My mother's dismissive glance, my father's mocking tone, Jessica's smug smile. They pulled me back into the role of the overlooked daughter. The temptation to shout the truth was strong, but I held back. The night stretched on, conversation rolling from Daniel's investments to Jessica's shopping trips. I nodded, politely offered small comments, but inside I was reliving the journey. I saw myself sweeping the dusty floor of that first office, felt the ache in my arms from carrying boxes, and heard the laughter of children filling the hallways of our new building. Every sacrifice, every lonely night, every tear had led me here, and they had no idea. I excused myself for a moment and stepped into the hallway. The air was cooler there, the faint scent of pine from the wreath on the door. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos from our holiday party at the office. Staff in ugly Christmas sweaters, clients smiling with plates of food, children posing with Santa. My heart swelled with pride. I whispered softly, "You have no idea who I am now." When I returned to the living room, my family barely noticed. They were too wrapped up in their own self-importance. That was fine. Soon enough, the truth would land like a storm they never saw coming. Daniel's voice filled the dining room, as if he had been waiting all night for his cue. He leaned back in his chair, balancing a crystal glass of wine between his fingers, and began to talk about his company as if he were presenting to an audience of investors. My parents sat forward, eager, nodding along as if every word were gospel. Jessica glowed beside him, her manicured hand resting proudly on his arm. "Our company is about to close the biggest deal of our history," Daniel said, his smile broad and confident. "Morris Realty Group has been working with city officials for months. We are on the verge of securing a development contract that will bring millions into this family." My mother clapped her hands like a child unwrapping a gift. "That is wonderful news, Daniel. This family will finally have the recognition it deserves." My father raised his glass. "To Daniel and Jessica," he said, "the future of this family." I sat in silence, watching the scene as if it were a play I had already seen too many times. My chest tightened, but not from envy. It was the sheer predictability of it all. My parents always saw success only in money and status, never in compassion or service. They believed wealth was proof of worth. Jessica looked at me with that smug expression she had perfected since we were children. It was the look that said she had won again, that I had been left behind. I forced myself to sip my wine calmly, though inside my thoughts were racing. I knew something they did not. I knew that Daniel's future was not as bright as he painted it, but I said nothing. After dessert, when the table was cluttered with half-empty glasses and crumpled napkins, my father leaned across toward me. "Emily, we need to have a serious conversation." I set my fork down slowly. His face was red from drinking, his eyes sharp. "It is time for you to do the right thing. You have been holding on to this family's resources for too long. Your sister and Daniel are building something real. They need security. You do not." I frowned, unsure where he was going, though part of me already knew. "We want you to sign away your share of the inheritance," he said plainly. "The house, the investments, all of it. You know Jessica is the one who will carry this family forward. You do not need those things." My mother chimed in quickly, her voice smooth but cold. "You should think of it as a gift to your sister. She has always been the responsible one. You have your little nonprofit, and we are proud you are keeping busy. But let's be honest, that is not the same as running a real business." The words hit me like stones. A little nonprofit, as if the hundreds of lives touched by my organization meant nothing. As if the years I spent building it were just a hobby. Jessica smirked, leaning closer. "It would really mean a lot, Emily. Daniel and I have plans, and this would help us move forward without obstacles. You would not want to stand in the way of family progress, would you?" I stared at her, my stomach churning. I had expected cruelty, mockery, but not this. To strip me of my share, to erase my claim to the family legacy, all in the name of Daniel's ambition. Daniel leaned forward too, his voice steady but insistent. "You should see this as an investment in your sister's future. Our company is about to explode. The city contract alone will bring in more money than you can imagine. Once we secure it, we will be untouchable." I clenched my hands beneath the table to keep them from shaking. I wanted to laugh at his arrogance, at the blind faith my parents placed in him. They did not see the cracks in his empire, the debts piling up, the investigations swirling quietly in City Hall. Instead of answering, I looked down at my plate, tracing the rim with my finger. I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly. If I spoke now, I would reveal too much. My father took my silence as weakness. He pushed a folded paper across the table toward me. "We had our lawyer draw this up. All you need to do is sign." The paper sat there between us, a simple sheet that carried the weight of betrayal. I felt every eye on me waiting, expecting me to surrender like I always had. Jessica whispered, "Just sign it, be generous for once." I lifted my eyes slowly and met hers. I let a small smile curl at the corner of my mouth, the kind that made her frown because she could not read it. "I will think about it," I said softly. My father grunted. "Do not take too long. This family needs to move forward." The conversation shifted back to Daniel's plans, their voices bubbling with excitement while I sat quietly with my thoughts. My pulse was steady now. They thought they had cornered me, but all they had done was reveal their greed. I remembered so many nights of being told I was nothing, of being reminded I had no future. And now here they were, begging me to erase myself from the family's future so that Jessica could shine. It almost would have been funny if it had not been so cruel. I reached into my purse for a moment, feeling the edge of the envelope once more. It was still there, solid and certain. Not yet, I told myself, not yet. The fire crackled in the fireplace. The tree lights blinked, and outside the snow piled higher. Inside, my family's voices grew louder, filled with dreams of wealth and power. None of them saw me sitting there calm and quiet, holding the truth that would shatter their illusions. It had been a rainy afternoon in early October when I first stumbled across the files that would change everything. The office at Chicago Social Impact Services was quiet that day. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the patter of rain against the windows. I was sitting at my desk finishing reports when David Brooks, the lawyer I often worked with on community issues, called and asked if I had a moment. He came in carrying a slim folder, his expression grave. David was not the type to dramatize, so the look in his eyes put me instantly on edge. He laid the folder in front of me and tapped the corner. "I think you should see this, Emily." Inside were photocopies of financial records contracts and bank statements tied to Morris Realty Group. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at, but then the numbers started to speak. Inflated invoices, shell companies' money shuffled around to disguise debts. It was a tangle of fraud so obvious that I was shocked Daniel had let it exist, on paper at all. "Where did you get these?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Let's just say people talk," David replied. "The city is already sniffing around, but they do not have enough yet. If what is here is accurate, Daniel is hanging by a thread." I sat back, the weight of it sinking in. My brother-in-law, the man my parents praised as a financial genius, was balancing his empire on lies. David leaned forward. "I know this puts you in a strange position, but you need to understand if this comes out, it will not just ruin Daniel. It could taint anyone tied to him." I nodded slowly. My mind was racing. My family's entire faith in Jessica's future rested on Daniel. They had built him up as their savior, their pride. If he fell, so would their illusions. That night I stayed late in the office, the folder open on my desk, the rain turning to a cold mist outside. I traced the lines of numbers with my finger, remembering the smug way Daniel bragged at family dinners. He thought he was untouchable, but I could see the cracks forming. The following week I met David again. We sat in a small coffee shop near City Hall, the smell of roasted beans mingling with the damp autumn air. He told me the city was already considering blocking Daniel's bid for the West Side development. They just needed more evidence. I asked what happens if they find out. He gave a grim smile. His company collapses, investors pull out. And depending on how deep this goes, he could be looking at criminal charges. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into the dark liquid. Part of me felt a flicker of pity for Jessica, for how devastating this would be. But another part of me, the part that remembered every cruel word, every smirk, felt an undeniable satisfaction. Still, I was not reckless. I knew information had to be handled carefully. I told David I would not interfere directly, but if the city needed support, I would provide what I could. He nodded, understanding. A week later, I was invited to a fundraiser hosted by Michael Thompson, the mayor. I had worked with his office before through my nonprofit, and he had always been respectful of my efforts. That night, he pulled me aside, his expression thoughtful. "We are reviewing Morris Realty's proposal," he said. "There are some concerns. Off the record, have you heard anything?" The weight of the folder flashed in my mind. My heart pounded. I measured my words carefully. "I cannot speak officially, but I have reason to believe there are irregularities." His eyes sharpened. "If you can point us in the right direction, we will look." I met his gaze and felt something steady inside me. I would not hand over my family's sins directly, but I would not protect their corruption either. I told him I would connect him with someone who had information. That was enough. By November, the whispers grew louder. Rumors spread that Daniel was scrambling to secure loans, that suppliers were going unpaid. Jessica posted photos online of vacations and shopping trips, but behind the smiles I could see strain in her eyes. My parents, of course, remained blind, bragging about Daniel's brilliance. At Thanksgiving dinner, Daniel could not resist boasting about the upcoming contract. He claimed the mayor's office was on his side, that it was only a matter of time. My parents beamed, raising their glasses to toast him. I watched quietly, knowing what they did not. The contract was slipping through his fingers. Later that night, Jessica cornered me in the kitchen while everyone else was dozing in front of the television. Her voice was sharp. "You are not jealous, are you? Daniel is building something real. You should try being supportive for once." I looked at her, the words forming on my tongue, but I swallowed them. There was no point. Soon enough, she would see the truth herself. December arrived with snowstorms and short days. At the office, we prepared holiday baskets for families, the halls filled with the sound of children laughing. Yet in the back of my mind, the folder still lingered. Each day, I wondered when the hammer would fall. It came in the form of a phone call from David. I was sitting in my office one evening, the windows dark, when the phone buzzed. His voice was steady. "The city has decided. They are pulling Morris Realty from the contract." For a moment, I just sat there, the words ringing in my ears. I imagined Daniel's face when he heard Jessica's fury, my parents' disbelief. David added, "This is confidential for now, but it will be public soon. Be prepared." I thanked him and hung up, staring at the silent phone. The storm had finally broken. At the Christmas dinner, when Daniel boasted about his bright future, when my father pushed papers across the table for me to sign away my inheritance, I held this knowledge inside me like a hidden weapon. They thought they were ascending. I knew they were already falling. I glanced at Jessica as she poured more wine, her laughter too loud, her smile too wide. Beneath it all, I saw the cracks. She did not know it yet, but her world was built on sand. And in my purse, the envelope waited. It was not just an invitation. It was the fuse that would ignite the truth, the proof that their scorn had built nothing while my silence had built everything. Jessica's laughter carried through the living room like the shrill sound of a bell that would not stop ringing. By the time the clock struck 9, the wine bottles on the sideboard were half empty, and her voice grew louder with every glass. She was draped across the sofa like a queen on her throne, her red velvet dress catching the firelight, her diamond necklace glittering with each exaggerated gesture. Daniel sat beside her with the smugness of a man who believed the world owed him deference. "Look at this," Jessica said, stretching out her hand to show off the massive stone on her finger. "Daniel got me the anniversary ring I always dreamed of. A carat and a half flawless cut." She twisted it slowly so the lights from the tree bounced off it. "Not everyone is this lucky, you know." My mother gasped, like she had never seen a diamond before, clapping her hands together. Robert leaned back smiling as though he himself had purchased it. Jessica's eyes flicked toward me, narrowing slightly. She tilted her head. "What about you, Emily? Still waiting for someone to buy you a ring like this?" Her words landed like a knife hidden in a compliment. The room fell silent, waiting for me to defend myself. I set my glass down carefully on the coffee table and folded my hands in my lap. "I am fine as I am," I said quietly. She chuckled, a sound dripping with disbelief. "Of course you are," Robert chimed in, then his tone heavy with false pity. "You know, Emily, maybe it is time you accept that you are not cut out for marriage. Some people are destined to stay alone, and some people," he gestured toward Jessica and Daniel, "are destined for greatness." The old ache flared in my chest, but I forced my face into stillness. My silence unnerved them more than any argument could. Jessica leaned back against Daniel, still smirking. "Well, you can always keep busy with your little nonprofit. Charity work is cute, but it is not the future." Daniel laughed, adding, "It certainly is not a business." Their words rolled over me like cold water. I let the sting wash through and fade, because underneath it was the steady beat of truth. They had no idea what I carried with me tonight. The fire popped loudly in the hearth. The Christmas lights blinked rhythmically on the tree, throwing small flashes of color across the room. My parents filled their glasses again, their cheeks flushed with alcohol and satisfaction. They thought the night belonged to Jessica and Daniel. I slipped my hand into my purse, fingers brushing against the smooth edge of the envelope. My pulse quickened. "Not yet," I told myself. "Wait for the perfect moment." The conversation shifted back to Daniel's business. He spoke about city contracts as though they were already signed, about investors lining up at his door, about how Morris Realty would dominate the Chicago skyline. My parents hung on every word, proud and eager, as if his success elevated them too. Jessica interrupted with a giggle. "When Daniel gets this contract, we will buy the lake house I always wanted. Imagine summers by the water." She turned to my mother. "You will love visiting." Margaret clasped her hands to her chest, her eyes shining. "That would be a dream, sweetheart." I sat back observing. Their greed, their blind faith, their arrogance. It all unfolded like a play I had seen many times before. I thought of the families I worked with every day, people who struggled to keep the lights on, who stretched every dollar. Those families had more humility, more gratitude than my own blood ever showed. Robert finally turned toward me again. "You could help Emily if you really cared about this family. Sign the papers." Hand over your share. Let the ones with real potential take the reins." The words were heavy with demand. My mother nodded vigorously. Jessica leaned forward with expectation. Daniel's smile widened like a man certain of victory. I let the silence stretch, sipping my wine slowly. Then I set the glass down, slid my purse closer, and reached inside. My fingers closed around the envelope. Their eyes followed the motion. Jessica frowned. "What is that?" I drew it out deliberately, the thick paper catching the light. I placed it carefully on the table in front of me, the way one might place a trump card in a game that had dragged on too long. The room stilled. Even the fire seemed to hush. Margaret's brow furrowed. "Emily, what are you doing?" I smiled faintly, leaning back in my chair. "Nothing. Just thought it was time I contributed something to this family gathering." Jessica's voice sharpened. "What is in there?" I folded my hands calmly, letting the envelope sit untouched in the center of the table. My heart thudded steadily, but my face betrayed nothing. Robert's hand twitched toward it, then paused. He looked at me, suspicion clouding his eyes. "You will see," I said softly. The tension thickened, pressing down on the room. My parents exchanged glances. Jessica's smirk faltered. Daniel's jaw clenched. For the first time all evening, I had their full attention, and I let the silence grow, feeding on their unease, knowing the night was finally shifting. My father's hand trembled as he pulled the envelope closer. The paper scraped softly against the polished wood of the dining table, a sound that seemed louder than the fire snapping in the hearth. Everyone leaned forward. My mother pressed her fingers to her lips. Jessica narrowed her eyes with suspicion, and Daniel sat up straighter, his knuckles whitening around the stem of his wine glass. I kept my gaze steady, my expression calm. Inside my chest, my heart hammered, but my face revealed nothing. I had waited years for this moment, endured countless humiliations, and now it was here. Robert slid his finger under the flap and tore it open. He pulled out the thick card inside, the silver lettering catching the glow of the Christmas lights. His brow furrowed as he read, his lips moving silently over the words. Margaret leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening. Jessica could not wait. "What is it?" she demanded. My father's voice cracked as he read aloud. "The families of Emily Carter and Michael Thompson request the honor of your presence at their wedding ceremony this coming spring." The silence that followed was deafening. The words hung in the air like smoke no one could clear. Jessica's jaw dropped. Daniel froze, the glass slipping slightly in his grip. My mother's hand shook as she took the card from Robert, scanning it again and again as if the letters might rearrange into something else. I reached for my wine and took a slow sip. "Yes," I said softly. "I am getting married." Jessica blinked rapidly, her voice rising with disbelief. "To whom?" Margaret whispered, eyes wide. "Michael Thompson, the mayor." The room exploded. Jessica shot to her feet. "No, that is not possible." She looked from me to the card, then to Daniel. "The mayor is working with us. He is Daniel's client. There is no way." Daniel finally found his voice sharp and angry. "This is a trick. The mayor would never choose you." I tilted my head, my smile calm. "He already has." My father slammed his palm against the table, the plates rattling. "Do not play games, Emily. Do you expect us to believe the mayor of Chicago would marry you?" I met his glare, steady and unflinching. "Yes, I do. Because it is the truth." Margaret shook her head violently, her earrings swaying. "How could this be? We never even knew you were seeing anyone." "That was the point," I said evenly. "You never asked. You never cared to know." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Jessica's face twisted, the color draining from her cheeks. She pointed at me, her voice shrill. "You are lying." Daniel tells her she is lying. Daniel pushed his chair back and stood, his face red, his hands clenched into fists. "This is not true. The mayor is reviewing our proposal. He is about to sign the contract. He would not risk his reputation by marrying you." I set my glass down and folded my hands neatly. "Actually, he already canceled your contract last week." The words dropped like a stone into water. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her chest. My parents stared at me as if I had just spoken in another language. "Yes," I continued, "the city pulled Morris Realty from the deal. They discovered certain irregularities in your finances. David Brooks sends his regards, though I kept that part to myself." Jessica's eyes darted wildly to Daniel. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me this is not happening." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing. My father's voice boomed again. "Emily, you cannot do this. This is your family. You cannot betray us like this." I felt the years of silence, the weight of every insult, every dismissal, pressing behind my ribs. I stood slowly, my chair scraping back. My voice was steady, calm, but it carried the edge of iron. "I did not betray you. You betrayed me long ago. The fire popped loudly, sparks rising up the chimney. Outside, the snow pressed harder against the windows. Inside the house, everything had shifted. Jessica slumped back into her chair, staring at the invitation as if it were a death notice. Margaret's lips moved soundlessly, her hand trembling against her glass. Robert's face turned a deep shade of red, his chest heaving. Daniel remained frozen, his jaw clenched, his dreams crumbling in silence. For the first time in my life, I felt tall in that room. I felt seen. The envelope lay open on the table, its contents undeniable. Their world of assumptions, of arrogance, of blind faith in Jessica and Daniel had shattered in a single breath, and I had not raised my voice once. Jessica's cry was the first sound to break the silence. It came out raw and jagged, as if her voice had been torn straight from her chest. She pushed back from the table, the chair legs screeching against the hardwood floor, and clutched the invitation like it was a piece of burning coal. Her eyes darted between me and Daniel, wild with disbelief. "Tell me this isn't true," she pleaded. "Tell me she made it up." Daniel's face was pale, his jaw rigid, but his silence said everything. The glass in his hand trembled before he set it down too hard, the stem cracking slightly under the pressure. My mother covered her mouth, whispering no over and over as if repetition might undo reality. My father's fists clenched on the table, his eyes bloodshot, his breath coming out in short bursts. I stood steady, the weight of years pressing into my words. I am not poor. I am not dependent on anyone's pity. Since 2017, I have built a company that employs more than 120 people. I have funded programs that have saved families, sheltered children, and fed thousands. While you mocked me, while you dismissed me as a beggar, I created something real. My voice filled the room, not loud, but unshakable. For the first time, they had to listen. Jessica shook her head violently. No, you're lying. She turned on Daniel, grabbing his arm. Tell her she's lying. Tell me we're still getting the contract. Daniel looked at me, his lips pressed so tightly they were white. Finally, he muttered, "The city canceled everything." Jessica gasped as if struck. She stumbled backward, clutching the back of her chair for balance. My father roared, slamming his fist against the table. "What did you do? What did you tell them?" I met his rage with calm. I told the truth. The city looked at the numbers, the shell companies, the debts. They decided for themselves. My mother's eyes brimmed with tears, though they were not for me. They were for the collapse of the dream she had built around Jessica. "You cannot do this to us," she whispered. "I did nothing to you," I said firmly. "I lived my life. I worked. I succeeded. You just never cared enough to see it." Jessica's sobs filled the room, harsh and broken. She clung to Daniel's sleeve, begging him to deny it again. But he pulled away, his face hardening with the look of a man cornered. The fire hissed, a log collapsing into ash. The Christmas lights blinked on the tree, a cruel parody of joy. I walked to the center of the room, standing taller than I ever had in that house. "For years you called me worthless. For years you compared me to Jessica, told me no man would ever want me, told me I would live off scraps. Tonight you see the truth. I am marrying the mayor of Chicago, a man who respects me, not for my money or my name, but for the life I built. And I did it without you." Robert surged to his feet, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You think this makes you better than us?" "No," I said softly. "It simply makes me free." Jessica collapsed onto the sofa, her hands covering her face. Daniel stood rigid, his phone vibrating in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his expression crumbled. He sank back into his chair, staring at the message as if it were a final blow. "What is it?" Jessica asked through tears. He looked up, his eyes hollow. "The investors are pulling out. The deal is dead." The words hung heavy. Margaret let out a strangled sob. Robert cursed under his breath. Jessica wailed louder, her hands clawing at her necklace as if it choked her. I felt no triumph, only a strange quiet settling over me. This was not revenge in the way they imagined. It was the truth surfacing, unstoppable, undeniable. I turned back toward the table. For years I stayed silent because I thought my worth depended on you seeing me. But now I understand. My worth was never yours to give. The room shook with the weight of silence. In the corner of my eye, I saw the snow falling thicker outside, blanketing the street in white. Inside, my family's world collapsed under its own weight. I picked up my purse from the chair, my movements slow and deliberate. My father's glare burned, my mother's sobs filled the air. Jessica's cries cracked into silence. Daniel stared at his useless phone. I paused at the doorway, looking back one last time. The glow of the Christmas lights shimmered over their broken faces, the very people who once gloated over my humiliation. I whispered only 2 words, "Merry Christmas." And then the phone in Daniel's hand buzzed again, louder this time, the screen lighting up with another notification that promised even worse news. The room did not sound like my childhood home anymore. The warmth had gone out of the fire, though flames still burned. What remained was the crackling of ash and the shallow, uneven breaths of people who once seemed larger than life to me. Jessica sat on the sofa with her makeup smeared, staring at her ring as if the diamond had turned to glass. Daniel looked like a man who had lost not only his money, but his mask. His phone abandoned on the table, flashing messages he could not bear to read. My mother wept softly into a napkin, shoulders shaking, while my father slumped in his chair, his pride shattered, his anger spent. For the first time, I looked at them without feeling small. The weight that had followed me through every holiday, every dinner, every gathering was gone. They had tried for years to convince me I was nothing, but now I saw them clearly stripped of their illusions. They were just people flawed and fragile, clinging to a world that had collapsed around them. Clara appeared at the doorway, then hesitant, holding her coat. She had come back into the house quietly, almost as if she sensed something had broken. Her eyes moved from me to the others, and she seemed to understand without words. She stepped closer and laid a hand gently on my arm. Her touch was steady, grounding. She whispered, "Justice always finds its way, Emily." Her voice carried more weight than anything my parents had said in years. I nodded, my throat tight with gratitude. Robert tried to sit up straighter, but his voice cracked. "You think you won tonight. You think this makes you better than us." I looked at him, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. "No," I said, "this is not about being better. It is about finally being free." Margaret let out a sound between a sob and a laugh. "Free? You call yourself free after destroying your sister's life?" Jessica shot me a look, her eyes red. "You ruined everything," she spat. I shook my head slowly. I ruined nothing. The truth was always there. You just refused to see it. The silence that followed was heavier than all the shouting that had come before. I glanced around the room, at the tree with its blinking lights, at the stockings hung by the fireplace, at the plates still holding scraps of food. This was supposed to be a Christmas celebration, a night of joy. Instead, it had become a reckoning. I picked up my purse from the chair and turned back toward them one last time. I thought of the young girl I used to be, the one who sat in the corner with her report cards ignored, who wore thrift store jeans while her sister flaunted new dresses. That girl had been told she was worthless, but tonight she stood taller than she ever imagined. "You always taught me that family meant loyalty," I said quietly. "But you forgot that loyalty is built on love, not control. You forgot that respect cannot be demanded, only earned." No one responded. Their faces told me they finally understood. I walked toward the door. Clara followed me, holding her coat tighter, her presence a shield of kindness. I opened the door and stepped into the cold night air. Snow was falling steadily, covering the driveway, muffling the world. For the first time in years, I inhaled deeply and felt no weight pressing on my chest. The neighborhood was still, the houses glowing with holiday lights, but my path forward felt brighter than ever. Michael was waiting for me downtown, and with him a life built not on shame but on respect. As I walked down the steps, Clara's words echoed in my mind. "Justice always finds its way." I smiled to myself, whispering into the snowy night, "Merry Christmas." And now I want to turn to you, the one listening to my story. Have you ever been underestimated, dismissed, or mocked by people who were supposed to care for you? Have you ever carried the weight of silence until the day you finally laid it down? Share your story with me in the comments, because I know so many of us have walked through the same fire. If my journey spoke to you, let me know by liking this video and subscribing, so together we can keep telling stories where justice, dignity, and self-respect always rise in the end.